大家好，欢迎大家来到国际培训大咖五十谈，我是顾立民。上一周，我们非常荣幸的请到了国际著名的培训专家 Dr. Jack Phillips 杰克·菲利普斯来讲授了他的 ROI 模型。那么就培训的投资回报率，所有的一系列的问题，我们进行了深入的探讨。今天晚上，我们又非常荣幸的请到了另外一位非常重量的嘉宾，他的名字叫 Dr. Ronald Jacobs， 雅各布斯。雅各布斯博士呢，他原来是俄亥俄州立大学的教授，现在呢在伊利诺伊大学 Urbana-Champaign 叫UIUC 大家一提 UIUC 这个名字，大家都知道。那么伊利诺伊大学教授呢，他也是对外交流中心的主任。那么他呢，本人呢就是人力资源发展或者叫人力资源开发这个领域的教授。今天晚上我们将围绕着 Dr. Jacobs 他的主要的成就之一展开。那么 Dr. Jacobs 呢，我们管他叫 Ron， 他也是我的很好的朋友了啊。那么他呢，主要成就呢是 SOJT， 叫 Structured On-the-Job Training， 叫做结构化在岗培训。伊利诺伊大学，我和丁辉老师在2014年的时候呢，去过，就是 Dr. Ron Jacobs 给我们安排的。然后呢，在伊利诺伊大学做了2场的报告一个是博士生班，另外呢一个是硕士生班。那么今天晚上呢，我们就围绕着结构化在岗培训这个话题呢展开。那么结构化在岗培训它到底是什么呢？跟在岗培训有什么区别呢？结构化在岗培训在什么时候用呢？实施过程当中有什么重要的节点和需要注意的地方呢？另外，它与集成化学习还有这个EPSS 叫电子化绩效支撑系统等等，还有我们的在线学习等等，都是什么关系呢？我们带着这一系列问题，就隆重的有请 Dr. Ron Jacobs。 Hi Ron, how are you?
Hi George, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, sir. It's been some time that we last saw each other.
It has been too long, unfortunately.
It is. Yes, 6-7 years now.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yes. And well, right now through the internet, through Zoom, this is probably the closest we can get.
Well, regardless, it's still very nice to be here with you and to see your face and have a chat with you today.
You bet. And thank you for accepting our invitation to be on the Training Master Series and to share your expertise with our audiences in China and throughout the world. Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to be invited, and I'm pleased to be here today. So I'm looking forward to having our little conversation and sharing some ideas.
Just for our audiences, Ron, would you please introduce yourself? Tell us where you grew up, where you went to college, what you studied, and tell us where you live and work now.
Oh my goodness. Well, I won't go back too far, but anyways, I received my PhD at Indiana University. Many people listening to this will probably recognize that university name. And I've been for the last 41 years, if you can believe that. I look so young, I know that. But for 41 years, I have been a professor of human resource development at 3 universities, primarily at Ohio State and now at the University of Illinois. And that, in addition to me being a university professor, I have been quite active as a consultant working in organizations. And what I have tried to do is to blend my academic research and development efforts with my practice. And this is maybe getting ahead of our story just a little bit, but it's been my philosophy as a faculty member that I need to be in the context of practice as much as possible, to bring that information back to my students, to test my work to make sure that I have credibility in both arenas, not only in the classroom, but also in practice as well. So I am currently a professor of HRD at the University of Illinois. And unfortunately, because of the current situation, I only get to see my PhD students and my students in general on Zoom. So just as we are doing right now. So,
Right.
so this is not an unusual occurrence for me.
Right.
I can share more information about myself as we go through the context of the conversation, but I don't know if I want to bore everybody with all the details.
No, we want to hear more as much
You
as
want
you
to
can.
hear more? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I should add, since you ask, that I have been to China many, many times, as you know. Maybe, I don't know, two dozen times, maybe 20 or 30 times in the last 15, 18 years or so. And I've worked with companies. I have consulted internally with companies, large companies, of course. I have given public workshops, and I have attended professional conferences, and I have also participated in helping to, last November 2019, the first research conference on human resource development. And so I feel that I've had some meaningful contacts, and I have former PhD students who are there, and many friends and colleagues like yourself as well.
And I know that Dr. Cui and Dr. Hu, Dr. Cui Lianbin and Dr. Hu Li were your students or business partners as well?
Well, they were not my students. A lot of people think that they were, but they've been my associates in a sense in many of
Right.
the things that I've done here,
Right.
here in China. And so as I say, it's been a very interesting and very, I would say, very instructive opportunity, because I've not only by working with some of the larger companies like Huawei, that I've also been able to visit other countries on behalf of those companies as well. So
Right.
I feel that I've had as much contact as anybody has had that could possibly have, being a non-Chinese speaker and being from the West.
And the reason I'm asking you to share more of with our audience of your background and your career path is because a lot of our audiences are very young and they want to be, there are masters, like you like yourself.
Mhm.
They want to be the guru like yourself in the future too. So the more and share. I know we have time, and then during the interview, please share with us too. And most of you come to China maybe 2,000 times, and one of the most noticeable work of yours is the biggest achievement is SOJT. I have to mention that.
Mhm.
And a lot of our subjects are around. It's going to be around that.
Okay.
SOJT, just for our audiences, is called structured on-the-job training. It
Mhm.
is on-the-job training, but it's more. It is on-the-job training, but it's more than on-the-job training. It's structured on-the-job training. So it's
Mhm.
called S-OJT. So and Dr. Ron Jacobs is the inventor of it. So it's his baby. So Ron, will you please, first of all, describe for us the SOJT? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very kind words about my involvement in that. And structured on the job training, or SOJT, I started working on that topic, believe it or not, around 1987. I published an article in Performance and Instruction Journal about a project that I had done with some of my graduate students, and we had reported how we had implemented some form of on-the-job training, and we had also reported some financial impacts from the use of that training approach as well.
Mhm.
But when I talk about structured on-the-job training, I'd like listeners to realize that I'm
Mhm.
not necessarily, I tell people very quite frankly, I do not, my interest in SOJT was not
Mhm.
necessarily about the training approach alone. And I think this is very important for people to understand. The
Right.
training approach that we call SOJT is just simply a means. It's a way of achieving outcomes. And the bigger concern that I've always had, and I always tell people this, is about how we can respond efficiently and effectively to help people, to help develop people when the work changes or when their situation changes and new information has, new skills and knowledge have to be acquired. And so when you think about it from that perspective, more of a conceptual perspective, and ask the question from an organization's perspective, how are we going to respond when things change? Then you have to say, well, HRD has ways of responding, and there's many different training approaches that might be identified. You know, people today are very interested in online learning programs. But when you think about SOJT has some very unique characteristics that make it different from some of these others. And if you will allow me just to continue to chat, I will explain some of
Please,
these with you.
please. This
Okay,
interview for.
okay. Well, SOJT is different from a regular training program, a training classroom program, because first of all, it occurs in the context of the work. Okay, so it doesn't occur in the corporate university center. And that's something that, first of all, many HR people find a little different. The other aspect of it is that the focus is on tasks or units of work that people are supposed to be doing on their jobs.
Mhm.
So SOJT is not about talking about a topic such as safety or leadership or things like that. It's not about presenting a topic, it's about a specific unit of work that the individuals are expected to perform on their jobs. So they are learning something that's related to their job expectations. And that one-to-one correspondence is the critical aspect that differentiates SOJT from most other training programs today. Now, the other aspect of SOJT is that you take experienced employees and you give them enough skills to be a trainer in the
Mhm.
context of the work setting, and then you have a what's called an SOJT module, you know, documentation of the work that people have to learn.
Mhm.
And the last aspect of SOJT is the accountability aspect. And that means that at the end of the training, there's a performance check. So it's not just saying, okay, it was very nice to have this training program. Uh, nice to see everybody here. We're going to go back to our workplaces now, as most people do in a classroom training program. But at the end of an SOJT session, you expect the trainee to actually perform, whether
Mhm.
they're operating equipment or they're working with a subordinate employee to give feedback, whatever the task might be, that's what you expect the trainee to be able to demonstrate
Mhm.
to somebody who observes, and that information is officially recorded on a document called a performance check. And so that accountability says this person has been trained, this person has learned,
Mhm.
this person can demonstrate what they've learned. Now, they may not be ready, you know, like an experienced employee to do it
Right.
like an expert, but that's all we can expect from a training program, is to give them that baseline of being able to perform at that level.
Mm-hmm.
So SOJT, sometimes in a sense scares, if you understand what I mean. It scares some people in organizations because it's much easier to offer a course on a general topic like coaching or
Mm-hmm.
leadership, or the responsibilities of a new manager or supervisor, those kinds of things. And then it becomes a little bit more difficult to say,
Mm-hmm.
what are the responsibilities of this person specifically, in terms of like the duties and the tasks that that
Right.
person does in their jobs, and how do we document that information, and then how do we use that documentation as part of the training.
Right.
And just I'll say one last thing, and then we can kind of go back and forth a little bit more. But
Yeah.
this is an opportunity, I find, for many HR, HRD professionals, particularly people
Mm-hmm.
starting off in the profession. It's an opportunity to distinguish themselves, because too many of our people in our field prefer, I'm going to use an American expression that maybe you can help me translate into Chinese. Too many people in our field, in organizations, are afraid to get their hands dirty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And for me, that means the HR person, HRD person goes into the work areas, does documentation with subject matter experts, write things down. You get confused doing it. You have to go back and talk to them a second time, and maybe a third time, and get it approved and everything, as opposed to just saying, well, I'll look up some information about a topic and offer a course on that topic. Getting your hands dirty means that you're getting involved in the work of the organization, and you're using your toolkit, job analysis, task analysis, all those different things, to be able to make a contribution. And SOJT relies upon that information to be effective.
Yep. Just for our audience, Ron just said to get your hands dirty. That's the American expression. That means that HRD person has to be in the field, on site with your internal or external client, and then to use your own tools, set of tools and processes and whatever you have to help them solve real problems, instead of hiding away in your own very comfy cubicles and doing some paperwork. That's not consulting. That's not creating real value. But
Mm-hmm.
get your hands dirty is being on the ground.
Yes,
Do
I
real
had it.
field work.
Yeah, you understand it exactly, and I don't know. Maybe you can offer some Chinese
Yes, we will translate this into
Okay,
Chinese.
but I gave a speech in Korea about a year and a half ago at a research center in
Mm-hmm.
Seoul, and the group of people were primarily not practitioners, but they were labor economists, people
Mm-hmm.
who look at data, but they're very interested in HRD policy at the national level, regional level.
Mm-hmm.
And I was explaining to them how important it was for them, because they are so used to doing their work from the computer, looking at data, employment data, wages, those kinds of things, to help set policy. And I suggested to them that it might be helpful, because I asked them, how many of you have ever participated or have skills in conducting an occupational analysis, of which many of the occupational standards are based on?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had really had that experience. And so I made the comment to get your hands dirty,
Mm-hmm.
not literally get your hands dirty,
Right.
but you have, like you say, you have to stop hiding in your office and go where the work is and the performance is. And that gives you an idea of what the requirements are if you want to make a contribution.
Exactly. And Ron, I just want to ask you some of the very simple. First of all, how many countries have you been? You're an international consultant also.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I've been
Never
to
counted.
like 100 countries, but what I do is that I tend to go to several countries for long time. And for a long time, I have been going to China. Maybe it's stopped now, but maybe it will start up again. For a long time
Well,
in Asia, I've been to Korea many, many times and to Malaysia many times and Singapore. I tend to go where people are using my work and embrace the ideas that I have. Right now, believe it or not, I've been doing quite a bit of work in Ethiopia, in Africa.
wow.
And Africa is coming close to being on its own. And
Hmm.
there's much involvement in Ethiopia from Chinese business interests.
Yep.
And so if you go to that African nation in East Africa, it's not uncommon to see a Chinese person walking down the street because Huawei has a large presence there, um, other construction firms and those kinds of things. So I don't know. And in Western Europe, there has been some adoption of my work, especially in the Netherlands. Um, Countries that have had some background with the apprenticeship systems and understand the importance of learning in the context of the workplace. So if you ask me a number, I'll say 20 countries, maybe more, maybe
Yeah.
100, 1,000.
Ron, may I ask you, how old are you now?
Well, that's a very dangerous thing to ask because I look so young. In fact, I think, George, I look younger than you. So I'm going to say that I am okay. I am 1 year older than you.
Thank you.
I'm
Because
I'm dodging the question.
yeah, I know. Because you
But
know,
it's interesting you asked me the question, but it's a very, when I go to China especially, and
yeah,
sometimes in Korea, but
right.
I'll do a workshop and because I have a lot of energy and people scratch their heads and they wonder, this guy looks young and he acts young and he's always has a smile on his face and making jokes and things like that. And yet he's done all these things. And so if you do the
Right.
math, it
Right.
doesn't seem to add up. So I'm okay, George. I admit it. I'm an old guy.
Well, the reason is we have on the training master series in the for the especially for the Chinese and Eastern Asia audiences, seniority is you have been in the country, you know the culture here,
Yes,
so that's why
quite a
I'm
bit. Yeah.
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 Anyway, the you mentioned HRD quite a bit, and then I'll come back to SOGT, but just clear the questions.
Mm-hmm.
HRD, you mentioned you are HRD professor. As far as you
Correct.
know, is there any HRD program in China? That's number one question. And
Mm-hmm.
what is the difference between HRD and HRM? I asked
Okay.
this question to Dr. Bill Roswell
Uh,
2 weeks ago, and he explained to us too. But I want to hear from your version of it because you are a HRD professor also.
right, right. Well, it's very interesting. You know, we have two fields of study that seem to cross over, human resource development and human resource management. And, you know, this is a question that I get from many of my students because they may have come out of practice and they see the combining of the two sets of activities. And so when if they are a practitioner, they look for maybe HR jobs as opposed to HRD jobs, and somehow it gets connected. But I think for me, you know, there's plenty of things to read about the differences between HRD and HRM, but for me, it's the last word in each one of those. One of them is development and one of them is management. And when you think about development is a process of doing something, of taking an entity, people, organizations, whatever, from one place to another place.
Right.
So I think HRD is about change in a general sense. It is a process that seeks to implement change in some way, whether it be individual learning or organizational change. That seems to be more of the person who is interested in HRD kinds of topics. HRM, management.
Right.
And management has to do, for me, with continuity and stability. And for me, management is about ensuring that the organization is adhering to its policies, it's doing the things that it needs to do. Of course, there's a lot of change involved in HR responsibilities as well.
Right.
But it's interesting to note, and maybe this is not a fair thing to say, but I will say it regardless. But I notice that when I meet HRD people, the people that are attracted to HRD tend to be people who are more interested in making something different. And HR people tend to be people that want to maintain the current state of whatever of the organization through their policies, through, that's a very unfair characterization, but I have that impression because I've met so many people over the years, and it's cross-cultural too. People in very, not only in the West, but also in Europe and in other places, HR people tend to be more interested in maintaining as opposed to the change. And that's not a very scholarly response to your question,
No.
but there are scholarly perspectives, definitions of HRD, definitions of HRM that you can find. HRM is includes things such as compensation, benefits, selection, those kinds of things. HRD tends to be more about learning, change management, those kinds of things. So, this is something that we could continue to talk about, but I'm sure that when Professor Rothwell discussed it, he probably referred to some of the materials from ATD, Association for Talent Development, that have identified the domain of HRD, and distinguish it in that way. But I think I've given a little bit different kind of response that people might be interested in thinking about.
That really helps.
Yeah,
really helps.
My career has been, just an addition to that, my career has been focused on HRD. And at one time when I began my career, we used to call it training and development, or just simply training. And over the time, in the late 80s, we adopted the word, or the phrase, human resource development as a parallel with human resource management. And we now have journals like Human Resource Development Quarterly, Human Resource Development International, those kinds of things, and professional organizations, the Academy of Human Resource Development. So when you think about the definition of a field that has both practice and scholarly research components to it, HRD is a distinct field from HR. But here's the problem. The problem is, not the problem, but the phenomenon is, in practice, managers don't care about the distinctions between HRD and HRM. They just put together departments and functions and say, what are the things that we need in our organization? And that's how they come together. So you have a department that looks like HRD and HRM kind of combined.
Right.
I'm sorry to take more time on that.
Well, thank you. That really
Yeah.
helps. Let's come back to the SOJT. So structured OJT. Everybody knows what OJT is, on-the-job training, and SOJT. So what does it tell us? In very simple descriptions, can you tell us what makes it structured? What's the structured feature?
Okay. Well, the structured feature comes from the fact that first of all, you're using a process to develop the training. And
Right.
instead of just telling, thank you very much.
Is that the process?
That's the process. It looks
Yep.
like it to me. And, you're using a process. And so instead of just telling somebody like an experienced employee, like if I was a new employee and you were on the job already, the supervisor might say, hey, George, please train, take Ron around for the next week or two and show him what you do. And that would be an example of unstructured on-the-job training. Structured on-the-job training is planned. And so you have this process that you held up, and you held up my book, and so I'll hold up structured on the, there is a Chinese translation of this book.
It is.
Yeah, as well.
Yep.
So that gives it the structured part. Another aspect of the structured part is when the trainer delivers the training, that person is going to use a process. He's going to use a process just like you would use for delivering a lesson. Prepare the trainee, deliver the training, require feedback, require a response, provide feedback, and evaluate performance. And so the trainer is using some kind of structured process, not just doing it out of their heads. And the last aspect of it makes it planned is that there's a change management process surrounding it to make sure that it's implemented and institutionalized in the organization, helping the organization move from unstructured OJT to structured OJT. Now, I don't know what question you're going to ask next, but if I can go let me go just a little bit further, and then maybe that'll take us to the next part of our discussion. The next part of the discussion is the question of, if you do all this planning for the SOJT and everything, what's the value to the organization?
Exactly.
What do they get out of it? You go through all this, and so the HRD or the training professional goes to management and says that I've read this book and it says that we should do this on our jobs for our training programs. And the manager says, why should we do that? Because isn't it true that eventually people will learn how to do their jobs anyhow? If you give people enough time, they'll make enough mistakes, they'll figure it out over time. And that's the question we've been answering for the last 30 years or so. And you do that through doing a financial forecast. And we do that at the beginning of our projects. And it's very easy to do. I mean, not simple, but it asks some basic questions. It asks about the outcomes of performing the work. And it asks about the efficiency of doing the work. So what you're trying to do is understand, based on the investment, what financial value can you expect to receive? For example, if people learn to do a unit of work through structured on-the-job training, you would expect them to do a better job, like interact with customers more successfully for salespeople. And as a result of that, you would expect higher sales. Because they're more effective. They use a process, they've learned a process, and they use a process with their customers. And so the question then becomes, what's the relationship between the amount of higher sales that you can achieve and the investment that you had to make to get that higher sales? Now, with unstructured on-the-job training, there's basically no training investment. So if people make mistakes, if they make errors with their customers, or if they have low quality, lots of rework in the workplace, that's just what you would expect. And those are the things that we are trying to reduce. So the simple answer to that question, and the thing that I show people to do in workshops that I do, and also in the graduate classes that I teach, is to do a financial analysis, an impact analysis. I don't worry about too much about the satisfaction and all the other levels that people talk about. The most important issue for me is the financial impact. That's, for me, the bottom line, because we want to know if we're going to invest in SOJT. There's some other outcomes that I can talk about, but the bottom line is, are we going to produce something of higher value that's greater than the investment that we made? And that's the kind of language that the HRD, the HR person, has to engage a manager to say, well, we've tried the other ways, maybe just having people learn on their own, or unstructured OJT, or a classroom training session. And these are the impacts that we had. And now we want to try SOJT because the history shows us that it can give us greater, what we call training efficiency and training effectiveness. Now, I've been doing, it sounds like this is a commercial a little bit, but this is the truth. And I've published these in many different places, both in journals and in book chapters. And also in the course that I teach, the students actually do this as part of their course requirements, as part of the project. They do a financial analysis of the projects that they're working on. And invariably, we can show that SOJT, compared to unstructured on-the-job training and classroom training, there's greater efficiency. That means people learn faster, and there's greater effectiveness. And that means that their work outcomes are of a higher quality.
Right.
So in other words, they learn how to become a salesperson, but they learn the sales process better. They learn how to inspect something critical like a hard disk with more accuracy. So there's fewer or more accurate rework or discards and things like that. So we have plenty of evidence to show that, SOJT makes financial sense.
Right.
So you asked a simple question and you had a 5-minute answer.
That's what I always wanted. And so thank you so much for that. And the next question is still on the SOJT. Is so structured, it's planned, is what you said just now, is it has to do real work and produce the same, the expected performance results. Basically, it means show me the money. The famous tagline from Jack McGuire. But so SOJT, so what is the differences between, you can answer them, each one of them, but between formal classroom training, between SOJT and e-learning, between EPSS and JITT. EPSS for our audience is Electronic Performance Support System, and JITT is just in-time training. So Ron, you can give us a one by one or in.
Yeah, well, it's a comparison of training approaches, and everybody knows what a classroom training program looks like, a group of people and a trainer. And it's not only the format that you have, of how the delivery is going to occur, but it's also what happened before that. And SOJT relies upon processes before you do the training design. It relies upon being able to do a job analysis. It relies upon the person to be able to do a task analysis. And that is the way that you understand the components of what people are expected to do. In a classroom situation, it's not really possible to focus on units of work because you may have a session of 8 or 15 trainees and you can review their job expectations, but you can't really take the time and have each person perform in front of a trainer, giving them feedback and have them evaluated and those kinds of things. You can give them an awareness, you can give them some practice on something you may have introduced, but it's very difficult to do it in a classroom setting. And EPSS is a little bit different because it is grounded again in the workplace, but you're presuming that, or in the workspace, I should say, not the place, but the space. But you're presuming that there doesn't need to be a trainer, that other person involved. And so that, that differentiates SOJT from EPSS because with EPSS, it's embedded perhaps, and there's no trainer, it's self-guided to the person who's doing the work.
Right.
And then when you think about the just-in-time training, could be a way of describing a variation of SOJT. It just talks about how quickly you can respond to the issue at hand and how quickly you can be out there with an intervention to help people. So SOJT could be considered a form of just-in-time training, but it depends just on, how quickly you can, do the analysis and all those kinds of things. And as I mentioned earlier, the ability to do that analysis, at first, it scares a lot of people in our field because it means that they have to engage, they have to go outside their little cubicle and talk to somebody and learn about something new and try to think about how they can translate that into a training program. But that's part of our toolkit. And it's a very important part of our toolkit. So important, in fact, that there's a book on the topic that on work analysis in the knowledge economy, based on all the experiences that I've had in being able to do these kinds of things. I think I've covered your question. I was going to go in a different direction, but I will let you take the direction on.
I do have a lot of questions around this because for years I have been trying to figure out the relationships between this and that, and and I agree with you that SOJT at the very beginning there are so many delivery formats or delivery methods, what we call it in academia, delivery methods that ILT, instructor-led training, which is formal classroom training, and then there's online e-learning in a e-learning is a kind of a overwhelming umbrella conceptual name for all the technology-enabled learning activities. And then my understanding of, and correct me if I'm wrong, EPSS and JITT, EPSS is for on-the-job performance, is a cluster, as a central repository of information. Job or performance-related information is central repository there for audiences, for our performers. Just go there. And then just-in-time learning, just-in-time training, JITT, is something that EPSS hosts. Most of them, 100% or not 100%, but majority part of them are information. And then classroom training and e-learning, we process knowledge, convert them from short-term memory into long-term memory. And JITT is just something in between. like JITT has both the features of EPSS and the features of learning. So it's combining knowledge and information together. That make it a JITT, meaning just the right amount of time, just the right person, just the right subject, just the right topic, and just the right the information that you needed. And then, but the right to whether to process it, to reinforce it from short-term memory into long-term memory is in the hands of the performers themselves. And then they can just decide, oh, do I need to learn this, convert this from information into knowledge, because into knowledge means that's long-term memory. So if they do, and then they will just learn it. But from the designer, from the structured, on-the-job training or structured learning system point of it, we have to design it that way. If we don't design it that way, and then, for instance, this job aid is frequently used, and then I use it like once a week, but I want to learn it, but this is just a job aid. It doesn't have any reinforcement features in it. So meaning it doesn't have any interactivities. So I cannot learn, I cannot process. I really have to do the hard memory, and not everybody can do that. So from the organizational point of view, we have to offer them the capability, the features, the learning features for them to convert those information into knowledge. And then later on, they can throw away their job aids. They just can do it right away, on the spot, for the right results. And then they can say, I've conquered that. So that's my knowledge. And I mean, that's kind of what JITT is between the formal training system or learning system and EPSS. In the middle is a gray line. You've been to Eastern culture so many times. It's a perfect combination for the fast-moving, fast-growing economies. That's my understanding.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a great description of all these things. And you mentioned online, what's happening today, of course, is that so many training programs are migrating to an online platform because the necessity of coming together is a little bit more difficult. So what organizations are maybe believing is that people can actually learn skills through online programs. And that's not really possible because people don't have the opportunity to respond. They don't have the opportunity to practice some specific unit of work. Now, a number of years ago, a client of mine, who I respect very much, he said in their large company, which by the way also had operations in China, he said from a strategic perspective for their company, they only believed in two training approaches: online learning to give concepts and principles and talk about things and introduce ideas to people, and SOJT. So SOJT is about learning how to perform something in the context of their jobs. And so what many organizations have done is that they've blended online learning with SOJT, because one, you would not ever use SOJT to explain the coaching process that an organization wishes all of their managers to use. It's not for that purpose. So you would use maybe an online platform to explain the component parts of the coaching process, but then you would use SOJT to make sure that people can actually use and understand the use of those components. So SOJT can't fit all training objectives, but when the training objective is asking the person, can you do this that we're asking you to do, then you really have to ask which training approach gives the trainees the opportunity to practice, to get feedback, to be evaluated based on these, the criteria of what they're going to be doing later on. And that's transfer. That's the issue of transfer. I was going to tell a quick story. Can you let me tell a quick story?
Please.
I have to say, first of all, that my students know me as a storyteller because, and I always tease them and I say that many of my stories are true. But I use stories quite a bit to illustrate points. And the point that I want to make is that many managers will look at SOJT and they'll say, why, if we have all this documentation and analysis of the work, of the tasks and everything, why can't we just give the document to the trainee and let the trainee read this information? And I don't have to bother my most experienced employees to be a trainer. That takes time, that takes money to take them off the job to perform that, that service within the organization. Why can't we just allow, and this made me think because you were talking about the EPSS. And EPSS is a sort of a self-driven activity by the individual to go through the materials. There's typically not another person involved. So my very quick story is that a long, long time ago, I was asked to, and I know that you have 2 children, George, so you'll understand this. I was asked by a hospital to develop a videotape program for new mothers on how to bathe their newborn babies. Okay. And so the assumption is that these mothers, young women, would, as they're in the hospital, they haven't been released yet, but they could watch on the video screen with a little check sheet. They could watch on the video screen how to bathe their newborn babies before they go home. And the assumption is that the mothers would, go through the check sheet and watch the video. And, we did everything appropriate from an instructional technology perspective. But here's what happened in reality. When the programs came on, the mothers never wanted to watch the program by themselves. They always waited for their mothers, their aunt, their sister, their girlfriend to come in, never a man. A man was never very helpful, but they knew that bathing the baby is a high consequence task. If you don't do it right, the baby gets, diaper rash and all the kinds of things, that you don't want to happen because it just causes problems. Babies cry and makes your life miserable. So bathing the baby is pretty important. And they were so afraid of watching it alone that they had to have a more experienced person, their mothers, girlfriends, sisters, some other woman who had experienced it, an experienced employee. And in my teaching, I always talk about the other, that other person. There's the trainee, and we always expect trainees to be able to do things by themselves, but we know it doesn't work for any extended period of time. The persistence of people to learn, and especially when there's a high consequence, whether it's on the job or babies. And I learned this a long time ago, back in 1981, believe it or not. I had
40 years ago.
Yeah, and I carried through, and I've seen it happen over and over. And so when managers say to me, why can't we just take these very nice SOJT modules and give it to trainees, let them read it, and that will be sufficient? I try to tell them of the importance of the other, that other person as part, and you have to understand that learning is essentially a social occurrence. So it's not just me looking at the screen and reading words and watching a video clip or something like that. It's me having the opportunity to ask questions, get clarification, be directed in certain things that I should be looking at. That's what learning is about. And that's the other person. And I believe strongly that learning is a social phenomenon. And that's why we can't just give, it's unfortunate, we just can't give people the materials and let them read it. And it works. Self-instructional materials do work. But the most effective ones, we know this, are when some other person is involved. And that's the justification for having SOJT with the novice employee who's a trainee and a more experienced employee who serves as the trainer. And it seems inefficient to many managers, but if you want people to learn and
Oh
be
yeah.
able to perform afterwards, that's what happens. We are, after all, humans and not
Right.
machines.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. We developed it that way for millions of years, over millions
Yeah,
of years. We're a
yeah,
group animal. We're group animals,
yeah.
and learning. Just you mentioned. I thank you so much. You mentioned a very good point, which is learning companionship. I call it learning companionship
Very
or
good.
learning buddies.
Yeah.
Learning buddies
Hmm.
are so important in the either classroom. Well, classroom training is much easier because it's ILT. There's always instructor aside, on the side,
Hmm.
but online delivery, the support of online delivery, online learning activities is so critical
Hmm.
because if the learner doesn't learn well, there's no future. There's no future learning activities. This individual is discouraged.
Hmm.
He felt like he's been orphanized.
Hmm.
He's been an orphan. He's out there in the middle of nowhere without any support. He's out there all alone. And then he got the order from somebody say, learn it. And then
Hmm.
they go, okay, they kind of, and then they feel alone. And then that is out of their comfort zone. So I think you hit a very good point. The learning companionship or the learning buddy system,
Hmm.
that's so important because in the classroom training, we oftentimes we divide them into groups, the island,
Hmm.
in the islands. So they pair each other, they give peer coaching, peer feedback, constructive feedback. But most of the time, the relationship, the learning companionship only happens on site. But
Hmm.
so that after the classroom, they go their own ways, you know. But to have a sustainable learning companionship and even maintain a group, that's so important because that putting them into a safe environment, learning safe experience, and then you can do whatever you want, you can learn whatever you want, but only within the group, and then you can learn it until you 100% grasp it,
Hmm.
100% learn it, and then you're out there for performance. So I
Hmm.
think you hit a very good point, but that's not being exactly delivered, especially right now during the pandemic. Everything goes online, and then everybody, most of the employees, I think they're throw out there,
Hmm.
go there alone, or they kicked
It's
out there.
it's the easy thing to do,
It
and
is the easy thing to do, but then
it
not the right thing to do.
and there's in the research literature there's a construct, an idea called time on task, and it has to do with it came out of actually children's ability to stay on task during reading.
Mhm.
And time on task means just as it sounds. It means, does the learner stay engaged? And what
Mhm.
we see on
Okay.
self-paced training, online learning, we see a high degree of time on task at the
Right.
beginning.
Right.
And by the middle, it starts going down dramatically
Right.
until people are just not interested in, because they don't know what's important. And it's true. Now, in my experiences as a professional, as a young professional, I was involved in developing many self-instructional modules, some
Mhm.
very complex modules having to do with people watching. This is old
Mhm.
technology, but watching a slide and cassette tape. Some of
Right.
our listeners may not even know what it means, but they were able to watch a still image and an audio cassette tape, and they would do some technical activity like test an engine or something like that. And it was a perfect system. It was
Mhm.
beautiful. The photography, the instructional design followed every principle that we need. Objectives were clearly stated. Everything was just beautiful, but people didn't use it. And the reason people didn't use it is because of that time on task issue. If anybody's interested, they should look at, many people may know the famous researcher by the name of Benjamin Bloom.
Oh yeah.
You know that from Bloom's taxonomy and things like that. And there's a very famous article that he wrote. I don't know how many people have read it, but it's called the 2 Sigma problem. Now, everybody should know that a sigma is the symbol for a standard deviation. And Benjamin Bloom wrote this article. I think it's the copyright is back in 1980s or so. And Benjamin Bloom spent his career promoting mastery learning. Mastery learning was for schools, for industries, for a lot of different, but it had to do with writing objectives, making sure that there was a connection between the objectives and the content and the testing and all those kinds of things. And he wanted to make education instruction more efficient and more available for more people. So he wrote this article, and it's kind of a sad article in a sense, but they did a review of literature of all the mastery learning articles, some of which he and his group at the University of Chicago had done. And they found that you could change performance, you could change outcomes 1 standard deviation through mastery learning. On average, you could move people from the normal distribution to 1 standard deviation above. But the educational innovation is not an innovation unless it's at least 2 standard deviations. Moving the group mean 2 standard deviations, 1 standard deviation may be possible through a lot of different means. 2 standard deviations is a way of saying this is truly something that has a innovative, and a long-term perspective to it. And the studies that they looked at that had the 2 Sigma aspect to it were those studies where there was coaching, where there was the other person. And it was, I interpret his article, and if anybody's interested, I can send you the reference to it. I'll even send the article to you. And when I read the article, I've met a lot of the great people from the 20th century, but I never got a chance to meet Benjamin Bloom. But when I read the article, it's an article that says, in a sense, that he failed because he spent his career basically saying we could move learning outcomes through very carefully designed training, educational experiences into an area where people will achieve. We won't have winners and losers in the classroom. And that's important from a Western perspective. And he's saying in the article, we couldn't do it. And the only way you can do it is by involving somebody else in that learning process, whether it's sitting next to you or, so it's not the classroom, it's that other person that becomes the trainer, that becomes the person that answers questions, that coaches you on how to do this. I think it's so when I tell you the story about the baby care, bathing a newborn baby, that's my experience, but this is supported by the research as well. And I'm fearful, to be honest. I think there's some very good examples of online programs, but we have to be very careful about the outcomes that we expect from those programs. They cannot give you people learning how to do tasks, things that
Yeah.
they would be doing on their job later on. It's very difficult to have that situation because it's like what we're doing now. We're not in the context and there's not that other person.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
would, go ahead, George.
yeah, go ahead. You go ahead,
Okay.
please.
Well, I was going to make that a transition to what I am involved in today, if it's okay
Hmm.
to mention.
Please.
Um, and this is something that I have been thinking about for some time, but I have resisted it. And now it seems the right time. And the question becomes, how do we combine the use of digital technology and the principles from SOJT? And that's this question that I have been trying to address. And I have been working on a platform called Situate. And this sounds like a commercial, but it's situate-training.com, excuse me, situate-training.com. And what we're trying to do is to use both a toolkit to help people develop the underlying planning, the documentation of the jobs and tasks and everything, and the real-time communication that we now do so easily and seamlessly.
Yep.
The issue today, of course, as you know, is that the experienced employee and the novice employee are not together. They are in different places today. They are remote. They could be at home. They could be in different cities. Um, one person could be in a factory environment in Guangzhou, and and the headquarters would be in Shanghai or something like that. And now we have this separation of where people are. You can't bring them together physically. So the question then for me is, can we use technology to bring them together, connect them, and still maintain the features of SOJT that we know that is for effective instruction, effective training programs at this level? And I think, I don't know, I think we have a solution. And I'm very happy to say that within the next month or two, we will have a, uh, a prototype ready for the commercial market.
Nice.
That's called Situate. And
Hmm.
Situate means you're putting the learning in the right place, situating it, putting the right, it's not in, online. It will be, using real-time communications, of course, like a Zoom, like we're doing now, but it will also have the training documentation. It'll have where the people are in the context of the work that they're doing. And it'll have other aspects to the toolkit as well. So if anybody is interested, they are most welcome to contact me, or there is a website that they can look at. But it's a big issue. How do we respond in our field? I think you and I were talking about this before the interview. How do we in our field? How do we respond to what's happening so fast?
Right.
The workplace and the work is changing so fast today. How do we can't just say online learning, but we have to think, what are the principles that we know that are effective? And how do we adapt those principles to new situations? And so that's what I'm trying to do.
Hmm. Hmm. That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate. Next question is SOJT. You talk about a lot about its application, its effectiveness, and so I want to ask the other side. Everything is a double-edged sword. So what are the challenges to deliver SOJT?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you can imagine, You're asking people to deliver training in the context of the work and the
Right.
workplace, and there are competing demands. So there's training that might need to be delivered, but there's also work that needs to be done. And so the largest issue for implementation and the sustainability of SOJT is balancing the competing interests of doing the work and the training. Now, it's interesting that if you send people away to a training program in a classroom out of the work area, managers don't seem to be too upset. They're upset, they miss the people, but they can get over it. But if they see training occurring in front of them in their work areas, and they know the work has to be done, it becomes that urgency to say, hey, wait a minute, we can't do training now, we have to wait and come back maybe. And so that's the big, huge issue. The other issues are, how that HR people and HRD people have the skills, the professional skills to prepare the materials. And then the other major issue, of course, is recruiting and selecting and developing those people in your workforce as trainers. Yeah, people were hired because they were engineers, good at their jobs, whatever they were doing, not to be a professional trainer. So SOJT tries to take away the variability. There's no telling jokes as part of, no warm up, like you would expect, like in a platform training. And because of that changes the train the trainer program for SOJT, as opposed to what you would expect a train the trainer program would be for a classroom trainer. It's just different.
Yep. So the other part of question around SOJT is evaluation, because all the learning and development professionals, they care about training program evaluation so much. Because that's a way of demonstrating their own value. So how does SOJT be evaluated, or how should be?
Well, from an academic perspective, and I think to respond to the interests of management, I have focused for many, many years on the financial impacts. And I think that's important. And so we have a growing body of knowledge. In fact, there was a review of literature that was published in Human Resource Development Review about SOJT, and I can make that available to you, that talks about those impacts. Yeah. But the other aspect of non-financial outcomes of SOJT are also, I think, also very interesting and compelling, because it may be more human, has more of a human face than just looking at the numbers aspect.
Right.
I did a very large project in the oil sector in Kuwait, the country of Kuwait.
Okay.
And if people are interested, there's an article that reports this project.
Please send it over. Yeah. I raised my hand a couple of times for your notice.
And we did the financial analysis to show that we could reduce the amount of training time and increase the effectiveness and all those kinds of things. Now, the reason I got involved with them, and I worked for this oil company, Kuwait National Petroleum Company, for a long time, over a decade. And the reason that they wanted to use SOJT is because they had a terrible accident where people were killed in a refinery, which is a very dangerous workplace, very hot steam and those kinds of things. And some people were killed, and they knew they needed to change practices. And so the consequence of error is so great. So when an engineer signs off on something, that person is held responsible for the consequences of doing it. And it could be people lose their lives, other people
Right.
lose their lives. And so one of the things that came out of the use of SOJT to train people on an entire job, engineering specialty, was increased level of confidence. Confidence not only from the trainees, but also from the experienced engineers who had to say, these people are ready to be promoted into a position of responsibility where they can sign off on work orders. And those work orders are the things that is, where the hazards and the risks come about. And so I've always, we know that as people learn, they have to, because they have to demonstrate that they're learning. But it's these other issues about retention. People feel that the organization is paying attention to them by spending this amount of time and effort on the training, and also the confidence that the people have. And I think it's even more important that the trainers have confidence in the trainees' abilities, that they're able to now do the work as prescribed. And so those are the non-financial aspects. And I might mention one other thing. This is especially true in Kuwait. For the first time, in some engineering specialties where you're not out in the field of a refinery, if you can visualize a refinery, it's hot and it's pipes and everything and steam. But there's also inside engineering jobs, like a control room engineer and a process engineer. And many times those are women engineers. There's still some about going out in the field. They're still a little bit hesitant to do that, but many women, young women, are now engineers, but they work inside the control rooms and things like that. Right. And what we were able to do is, for the first time, to have women trainers, SOJT trainers, which in many society, that's not a big deal, but in an Arab society that is so focused on differences between male and female roles, to have a experienced engineer woman training a new hire engineer male is somewhat of a breakthrough. And so all these things can occur, possibly, through SOJT, because it's based on the trainer's abilities, not who they are. And that's pretty important.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so very interested in how do we evaluate some subjective outcomes, because confidence, motivation, team morale, organizational atmosphere, all of those, subjective feelings, how do we digitize them? How do we put it into data, and how do we measure them? How do we increase them? How do we manage them? How do we increase them? How do we elaborate them? All those questions are, because we're humans, and those are the powers, our self-power, our modules. But in an organizational setting, everything is business. And so how do we combine them into those and then power the business? Probably today, I don't want to drag for too long because you probably have a whole set of process and how to measure them. And I'm going to ask this question to both Jack Phillips and Patty Phillips, because they have their own measurement too in that aspect. Oh, just to mention that you just mentioned Dr. Benjamin Bloom, and actually about on the 18th session of the TMS 50, the Training Master Series, on the 18th episode, I had the honor to have Dr. Bob Reeser, and he mentioned that too. Yeah. Bob Reeser from
sure. I know Bob.
Yeah. And he also talked about mastery learning. He said, so our learners should not be foreign about that term, because you have learned on the 18th episode, and now Dr. Jacobs just mentioned that again, so I just want to mention that. Thank you for mentioning
Great.
both.
Yeah. Very
Yeah,
important.
I know I have tons of questions about, actually in each and every interview I had with all the gurus.
I can imagine.
We can dig more.
Every person that I've seen on your list has a rich background and a rich set of experiences and much information to share. So
Everybody on my list so far, and I believe in the future, all the 50 people, they're mountains to me. They're mountains to me.
Yeah.
They're all, including yourself, with all the due respect.
You're very kind. You're very kind.
That's true. Because so far, and so sadly that we lost some people we lost recently this year. Well, we lost Bob Mager, 98, and just about 12 days ago, we lost Roger Kaufman.
Roger Kaufman.
He's a dear friend. He's on our second episode, and Bob Mager was on my list too. So anyway, so it is the mountains, that the height, that the altitude that you guys created is something that we look up to. That's why this program is so significant, that we want our viewers, young viewers, to rise up and catch up and stand on the shoulders of you guys, the giants, and then we can grow faster and becoming you, and even do some more achievements, because nowadays times changed. We have more technology, we have more tools at hand than what you guys did. You just mentioned cassette tapes.
Cassette tapes. We thought that was, if you could coordinate an electronic pulse from the tape to advance your slide presentation, that was the best you could ever do. We couldn't imagine anything different from that.
Exactly. At that time. Who would thought? Steve
Jobs.
Jobs.
So when people think today we've come to the end of technology and how to do everything, it'll change.
It will.
Yeah. I know that we're coming to an end, but I'd like to make one last statement about what's happening. Please. And I think this is maybe important for our the next generation of practitioners, and also maybe future academics as well, is that what we are experiencing right now is, a horrible situation globally. And it is something that is shaking up, is changing radically what's happening in the workplace and what's happening in work. And what's happening, I believe, is that at the end of all this, there will be an end to all this.
Yep.
There will be an accelerated adoption of new technologies, not of instruction, but of work. In the manufacturing sector, it's going to push not only the big companies, but small companies to adopt new ways. In Korea, I know, they're emphasizing the smart factory and being able to have sensors on all the machines and feed information. Now, what that means to us in HRD is that work is going to change.
It is.
In very radical ways. And we have to be prepared to be able to help our organizations and our societies to understand, not just in a general sense, not just to be able to say, well, workers will be doing more problem solving and critical analyses and those kinds of things. That's too global. That's too broad and general. We have to be able to help our societies and our organizations and our people to adapt to these changes. And that's our contribution. And my last advice to people, the next generation, is develop your toolkit in all the different ways, both from a researcher perspective, from a practitioner perspective, but we all have a professional toolkit, where we, not hammers and screwdrivers, but it's our abilities to do things, and make it as broad as possible, not just being able to deliver a training program, but you've got to understand these changes that are happening. I think the next 5 to 7 years are going to be very exciting in our field because organizations and societies are going to be looking to us to help people adapt to these changes. And we have in our toolkit, in our professional toolkit, the ways of helping and making contributions. So I look forward, maybe the next time I go to China, I'll be at an event, and I hope, this is what I hope, George, that somebody walks up to me and says, hey, I heard you on the Master 500 presentation, and one little thing you said helped me. And if anybody ever does that, I'll think that's from a teacher perspective and a consultant perspective, that's all you can expect in life.
Right.
So.
Just I'm sure that will happen. Thank you so much for mentioning the Korean smart factories and also giving the advice. That really covers my next two questions. But Ron, I want to go a little bit further. We have two more questions to cover, but
okay.
I really want to thank you for giving the advice to our young generations. I also have a story too. I went to a factory, a friend of mine. He's the general manager of a manufacturing factory. They produce little, electronic parts, very cheap, but huge quantity. They used everywhere, ships and hoppers and trains and everywhere, power systems, power grids and systems and everywhere in the society. So huge amount. And I went to his factory. His factory is located in Chengdu, in the city of Chengdu, Sichuan, just on the North Ring and next to the big airport. So I went into it. Everything I saw, it's not like a factory. It's like just an office building. And then he brought me to his office, and then we stayed there for like 5 minutes. And then I said, I can't wait to see your factory. So we went down to the factory. So he said, all I see, there's very few people. He used probably 1/3 of what a factory like his factory, the same size and productivity, he normally need. He only employ 1/3, and they're 24/7, and everybody using a pad. They have high mobility. Everything is recorded on the pad, what they do and everything. So they have higher mobility, and on the pad, on the system, he developed a software that literally manage everything in the factory. So like HR system, like paying system, like what you do today, what do you do next, what's the inventory, everything, manufacturing, everything is on that pad. So wherever you go. So the entire factory is highly automated. And the production is like the employees just watch them. It's a highly automated production line, and they're in the control room. And he said I pay 20 to 50% more salaries higher than my competitors, and they're very happy. They stay here, and I don't have an HR department. I have an HR department to interview, but my turnover is very low. Nobody wants to leave. So my question to you, Ron, is: do you think, you mentioned the smart factory in Korea? We have that already in China, and he's selling his software to many factories, manufacturing enterprises, and then it's very successful. He's building the highly automated. He got rid of everything. He doesn't have to sign. He has like 2 people in the accounting department. A factory like 3 to 4 billion RMB revenue per year. I mean, that size. So my question to you is, Ron, do you think HR function or some other functions will disappear in the next sometime 7-10 years? Because the future generations, we want to give them a perspective in the future, where we come from, where we see the future would be.
That's right. Everything, it looks like, everything's taken care of. They won't need training because everybody's doing their job.
On my back. Talking about this. HRD or HR jobs will disappear someday. Is that a
Well,
possibility?
I don't know. Like, who knows? But
Yes.
it's very difficult to predict the future. I don't even know what's going to happen this afternoon. It's now morning. Maybe my wife has some plans for me. I don't know. But, it's interesting that what you saw in that organization was the current state. And you and I have had many different, very rich conversations in the past. Sometimes we've drank coffee to long hours in the night and talked about things. And we know about system theory. And so system theory tells us that there's always a current state and there's always a future state.
Right.
And so what you saw in that factory looked like a beautiful current state of what was happening. And what we don't have is there's always going to be a future state, the next thing. And so while you saw a highly well-functioning organization, something is going to change. And I don't mean in the organization necessarily, but something externally, customer requirements, demand, product line, you name it, something's going to change. And it's usually driven from a external perspective. That's my view, and I teach this in a change class. Almost all organizational change comes from something derived from external. And that's going to happen. He may be happy now, but something's going to change. And with that change, he's going to have to do something about it. I don't, as long as there's that change, that prospect of change because of competition or technology change or something like that, product changes, that there's always going to be a need for us because we are about the abilities of people and people have to learn. Now, there's fewer people in the workforce, that's a fact, but we also have changes. I was going to mention, I did this will be as part of my Situate platform, but there's a skills gap analysis process that I use. And I had a study, I can make a press release available to you as well.
The fourth item, I'm
Okay.
jotting it down.
I have to remind myself what the four are. But I did a study with 4 manufacturing companies in Chicago. And maybe you and I someday can work together to do this with some companies in China. I would love the opportunity. All of these companies were manufacturing or production or warehouse operations. And, around Chicago, there's quite a few organizations quite like that because they're either tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers to major manufacturers like automobile industry or something like that. And we brought them together and we asked them to identify a job title that was common across the various organizations. And they identified a job title called team leader. Team leader is not a supervisor, but a team leader is above the hourly workforce, but that person is like very well knowledgeable about the work and has, facilitates the work of others and all those kinds of things. And so we asked 2 questions. The first question is, what do the team leaders in your organizations do now? And we did a traditional job analysis that had a list of duties and tasks that were associated with each of those duties. And then, there was some variation across the 5 organizations. And then we brought in a different group of subject matter experts and we said the following question. The prompt question changed. The prompt question was, what will team leaders do in 2 years from now? And so these individuals had to review what they are doing now and then think about where the organization is going, where technology is going, what's likely to happen.
Right.
For me, in my work, 2 years, with a pandemic, it was like
Right.
tomorrow. It was like 24 hours, things changed. But in a normal case, 2 years is about a good period of time that people can see on the horizon, maybe what customers are probably going to be demanding and those kinds of things. And so we developed a forecasted job analysis, having duty and task statements. And we were able to look at what got deleted, what got added, what got changed. And when you compile all those tasks, you get an idea of the planning that that organization has to be doing for the near future to make sure that the people are ready to do this. And what's interesting that we found, the team leader is kind of the middle person between a formal person in a management role and the frontline person. And that person is being pulled apart. Frontline employees were forecasted, were taking some of the responsibilities of the team leader, pushing it down, and some of the other responsibilities were being pushed up. But the team leader's role, that job, was being backfilled by greater necessity to use, interpret data, to respond to data. There's no programming involved, but like the reason I'm telling the story is because it confirms the smart factory. These organizations have to understand, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to move toward the smart factory. A critical position is the team leader. What are the specific expectations of that position in that future state? And those are the kinds of things that I think that HRD professionals, those are the kinds of contributions that they can make to their organizations. Now, the story that you told may be a special company. They may be able to operate with a very small group of employees, and because it's what we call a process industry, things move across.
Right.
But it's not true in all cases, and work, we know, is going to change. I'm excited. I wish that maybe you and I can be partners, do some studies on this and help some companies. But that's another conversation, not here, but, or maybe somebody listening might be interested in doing that. But that information will be part of the platform of Situate, because it's part of the planning for what training would be. People talk about needs analysis and those kinds of things, but I find that a little bit more passive than calling it a gap analysis, skills gap analysis. What are we doing now? What are people doing now? And what are people doing in that future state? Every time you ask me a question, George, I have another.
I know.
Another story.
I know.
So it's up to you to keep asking questions. I may
know.
run out of stories. I'm not sure.
We all have a lot of stories, and I love stories, and I love stories.
Like I said, some of them are even true.
Most of the stories actually are.
Most of them are true. Most of them,
everything actually, those are our own experiences, and so those are very valuable to the young generations, because we've been there, done that, So we don't want to pay them to pay the same price that we have paid. We want them to be faster and more effective than we are. So Ron, last question to you, as a closing, well, if you had a chance to start all over again, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, well, that's a terrible question. I would have not become an academic. I would have worked for I was supposed, when I graduated from my PhD program, I was supposed to work for AT&T
Uh-huh.
in 1980. And so
Uh-huh.
that gives away some more information about my age. But what happened was that they were breaking up AT&T into its little
Yep.
companies. There was a
1980
monopoly. 1980. It was,
1980 divestiture,
yeah,
right?
divestiture, exactly. And
Yep.
so they had given me a job offer, but not on paper. And I thought that my life was going to go into industry as a internal researcher, consultant, those kind of things. And I was very happy because I could live in Chicago and I was not married. How wonderful. But then they canceled the job, and the job that I offer that I received was to work in a university. And I was not happy, but then I realized maybe that's okay for now, at least. So, I think that, for the future is that, you ask the question, what should people do, or what would I have done differently? I have been extremely lucky because my age is has run my development as a professional
Okay.
has been in the same period of time as the development of our field. And so, as you know, by being a young person back in the late 70s, 80s, I had a chance to meet the people that we talk about today
Right, right,
and get to know them a little bit. Even though I was
right.
a person on the low status, I was happy to be there. And then graduate programs developed. And this one thing we didn't mention earlier is that unfortunately, we don't have HRD programs in China. This is a big issue. We don't have HRD graduate programs in China, but we have many faculty, as you know,
Hmm.
friends of ours, who are
Yep.
interested in HRD issues. And they may
Right.
be instructional technologists, uh, they may be in instructional technology, they may be in organization behavior, even government policy,
Right.
a lot of different areas, but they're also in, or vocational education, adult education, but they're interested in HRD. And I think one of my recent graduates, Tong Xiaoping, is in Beijing. Um, she's a PhD graduate. She's a new assistant professor at, is it Beiyang University? Oh my gosh, it's slipping my mind right now. Anyways, she and I have been working together with trying to bring together the community of, and maybe you can be helpful. We never had this conversation of of bringing together these people, individuals, faculty around the country, and also reflective practitioners, people in senior positions who understand the relationship between practice of research as a means to influence practice and practice to influence research,
Right.
get more interactions in those communities. And
Right.
so when I look at what's happening in China, it looks like where the US was in the late 70s,
Hmm.
1980 or so. And but as I say, I've been lucky. So I can't say that I would change too much because the major occurrences where I was involved in are the things that most students take for granted. Like we have scholarly journals that, that are very well known, Human Resource Development Quarterly, for example, that, young scholars in China, they are eager to publish in these journals in English
Right.
because they know it's so important to their careers. And
Right.
so the things that we take for granted today are things that I saw and participated in in their development. So besides the fact that I wish I was rich and more famous than I am, but I can't be
You're
greedy.
famous. You're famous to us.
I don't have any regrets because I've been
Great.
blessed to have experienced and to watch and participate in something very important. And I often share this with my students. And to be able to say that you knew people, you have stories about people and why things occurred at certain points, I think is really important. But everybody has their same, so young people today, it's not over. There's the same things that are happening today. And I guess being involved as much as possible is critically important.
Great, great. Your career, what you were just told us, you're lucky enough that your entire career probably synchronized the most critical stages of our of development in our field. So
It
that's
was,
why,
yeah.
so
Yeah,
lucky.
unplanned, not structured, unplanned.
And probably later, maybe 20, 30 years later, when the young generations today look at, in retrospect then, and then they probably say, oh, we did the same thing.
I hope so. I hope so, because that'll mean things are
I really do too.
moving forward and everything.
Yep.
So
Yep. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was good to be with you, George, and good to be with people that are listening in on this program. And I hope to be able to meet some of them in person.
In the future, right?
In the
right.
future,
the pandemic is over. Yep. Thank you so much, Ron. And
you're welcome. Thank you.
As always, as a good old friend for so many years. And stay safe, stay stay well, do good work, and keep in touch. That's
keep in
what.
Touch. That's right.
Yeah.
And
good old Garrison Keillor says. I always say that.
And as you know, I never say goodbye to people. I always say until the next time.
Until the next time. I got that. Time.
Okay.
Yeah. And
thank you, George.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's my interview with Dr. Ron Jacobs. How do you feel? Our talk is very long, actually. And during our conversation, we covered a lot of topics, actually all of the topics about SOJT, structured on-the-job training, including when to use it, what it is, what is the structure of the structured on-the-job training, et cetera, et cetera. I hope it helps. I hope it gave you another choice or another choice of interventions when you come to building your training system. Thank you, Dr. Ron Jacobs. Thank you for all of your contribution for over decades. And thank you, and we hope to see you again soon, especially, hopefully, in China again. Next week, we are going to have the very honor to have another guru in this field on our show. Her name is Dr. Jeannie Anderson. Jeannie Anderson has a lot of achievements in both in e-learning, in instructional system design, in e-learning and performance improvement. She's also a frequent national speaker and international speaker as well. Dr. Anderson was my professor at school. I started to know her more than 20 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, when I came to the United States to pursue my master's degree in HRD and training. And she was my professor. She was one of my professors. And so during our next week's call with her, interview with her, we are going to ask her a lot of questions about ISD, about performance improvement, especially about e-learning and her understanding and her predictions and where it goes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to ask her a lot of questions. So until next week, stay tuned, stay safe. Thank you and good night.